participants in the very first night meeting since a long time, and this time also. There was one thing. He was chairing the EuroA for 10 years. And of course, as a chair, he was never be in the position to having the closing keynote on a EuroA. And I think the discussion were about 30 seconds that he should do this for this first EuroA that was chaired not by him. And yes, I needed so long for the explanation, and the other said, yes. So, it is a great honor to have you here, Eric. I'm really happy. And he has no slides. And I think this is a really, really good idea. So you have to listen to him.
And there's no speech either, so I'm going to just leave and you can clap.
So you have to listen to him, and I just can recommend to listen closely. Eric Reiss.
Thank you very much. Friends, dear organizers, friends I haven't met yet, I want to thank you all for not taking an early flight out of Madrid today, sticking around for this last talk. I'm truly delighted to be here as the plenary speaker. It is a great honor. The other years I've been able to sort of dance around and introduce the speakers, and I've managed to sneak in some information along the way, things that I thought were important. But to actually have the luxury of 45 minutes to sort of say whatever I wanted to say, that's kind of new. The other thing is I don't do a lot of plenary talks. I'm perhaps best known for sort of being the cheerleader. I'm the one who gives the rah-rah keynote and gets everybody going. But this slightly philosophical reflection on what has happened over the past few days, I don't get to do that a lot. And it's hard work. And that's also one of the reasons I don't have slides, because if I had a canned presentation that I had already worked on back home in Denmark and came here, would it accurately reflect what we've experienced together the last 3 days? Probably not. So I spent a lot of time sitting in the back, taking notes, trying to figure out what I was going to tell you, without preaching to the choir and without being admonishing and saying, you're doing it wrong. The truth is, I didn't really hear a lot this weekend that I didn't agree with. I think that there are a lot of really, really interesting things I've heard. But to get back to plenaries, I did do some research, and as we know, you can't do user experience without the research. So, first of all, a great thanks to Peter Bogarts, Lutz Schmidt, Stuart Curran, also to Matthew Fetchko and Jeff Parks, who have all sort of taken me aside at one point and said, hey, listen, this is the way plenaries work. And because I didn't really believe everything they had told me, I actually went to SurveyMonkey and had a very, very stupid, very biased survey to see, what I could get people to tell me about. What do you expect from a closing plenary? What's it supposed to be about? I got pages and pages of things. The one I like is, I hate plenaries or keynotes. I paid good money to attend, and I don't like people telling me what I'm doing wrong. I also hate keynotes who come to a conference and are paid big bucks who have no fucking idea what we who paid good money to attend the conference said conference actually do. Oh, and I expect great slides. This is a quote. I'm sorry I used the F-bomb, but it's all there in SurveyMonkey. I'm going to disappoint a lot of the people who answered this, but I'll tell you, there was a lot of information here. So, of course, I figured, well, all right, that was part of the research. I'll do some more research. Now, according to the Minnesota Public Radio, which I have been told is only second to Wikipedia in international influence, they say that commencement speeches and closing plenaries affirm each attendee's search for knowledge. It often seeks to put their recent hard or not so hard work into the context of their future. Okay, so we're all on the same page here? Well, so you start to research, so what are the best practices of closing plenaries? And as an information architect, I found out that many of these have to do with cliches in very thin, very expensive books that you can buy at airports. So, as an information architect, I started to put these into categories. So first of all, we have gratuitous praise. He said, "You are the greatest people in the world. You, never before in the history of mankind have so many smart people gathered in one place. And you are all unique and special individuals," which is very interesting, because if you're all special, then basically nobody's special. And if we've all attended the same conference, what is it exactly that makes us unique? Well, I think you are unique. I'll get back to that. But it's one of those silly things that you keep hearing. And of course, Oprah Winfrey has something to say on this, believe it or not. Follow your passion. Follow your heart. Follow your dream. Now, let me be perfectly honest with you. If I had read this in a book of instructions, I would not have a clue what I was supposed to do. Follow your dream. But it does lead nicely to the next batch, which is dream until your dreams come true. Be true to yourself. Find what you love. Slightly more actionable, but it doesn't really provide much direction. And then, of course, we have the evangelists, the rah-rah cheerleaders who say, "Make a difference. You are our future. The world is depending on you," which is basically saying that my generation completely screwed up, and we're counting on you to save us. Yes, please. And then, of course, we have the admonishers. We have the rich CEOs in expensive suits and bad haircuts who tell us education pays. You've got to pay your dues. You have to work hard. You have to demonstrate your potential. Now, demonstrate your potential is actually the only useful piece of advice I've read in all of this bestseller blather. Oh, and by the way, on BBC News last night, I learned that Larry Ellison paid himself $63 million last year. Holy shit. I'm waiting for his book to come out. And then finally, where would we be without Seth Godin, who says, "Leap, commit, make something happen." You've noticed there are not very many words, but Seth's books are also very thin. So, yeah, I mean, this is all good advice. Are you all inspired yet? My God, I gave you Seth, Oprah, this is going to be a tough hour together. All right, well, so we'll leave the cliches for the time being. Of course, my first question was, why me? Why did I get invited here? And I got very helpful advice from the organizers, and I appreciate that. And by the way, to borrow a phrase that I learned a couple of days ago from our keynote, Mark Hafsensall, I have chosen this afternoon to be a pleasant troublemaker. So, let's start and talk a little bit about EuroIA. I was supposed to talk about sort of the history of IA, but let's leave history to the Wikipedia. We can all read about that. It's not really very interesting. But there are a couple of things that I would like to point out about this particular conference. First of all, I was tremendously pleased to see that 50% of our speakers this year were women. Now, I'm sure there are people out there, and also in Periscope land, who are saying, "Yeah, that's great," and fighting for the cause. But I assure you, during the 10 years that I chaired this, no one ever got to speak at EuroIA because of their gender, race, creed, or any other reason. They got here because they had a good idea. The fact that so many women are on our program says a lot about the state of Europe and how we work together. I went back through submissions over the past 10 years, and I counted. And it turns out about 20% of the submissions, on average, were from women. Now, this is the kicker. About 50% of those submissions were accepted. That's a huge percentage. So that's something to think about. And it indicates that whatever we're doing over here in Europe seems to be working. That's the one thing. The second thing is, what are we now? About 100 people? We were 100 people 10, 11 years ago when we started this. Is it a big conference? No. Is it a rich conference? No. Do we have huge parties sponsored by whomever? No. But somebody worked out, well, let me just start. When we started this conference, there were no conferences in Europe. There wasn't a single UX conference. There had never been a single IA conference. Peter Morville and Margaret Hanley had held a couple of talks in Paris at one point. That was it. Today, there are conferences all over Europe, and they can almost all be traced back to relationships and friendships that were forged through EuroIA. And somebody worked out last year or the year before that something like 15,000 people had attended conferences that would not have existed, or certainly existed in another form, had it not been for EuroIA. So give yourselves a big hand. You are the ones who are building this community. And also, I plead the sponsors. This may be a little conference, but for goodness sakes, give these people some money next year. We have influence far beyond what you imagine at this point. This is very important. It's been an interesting weekend because if we kind of look at our baseline, where we are right now, we're facing the same problems that the industrial designers were facing 60, 70 years ago. The problems that I personally experienced 10, 20 years ago, I'm still facing today. I don't think these things are going to change quickly. I mean, first of all, we're experiencing an information explosion. And we know how to deal with problems that the rest of the world hasn't even thought about yet. But it's difficult to communicate. Our job titles certainly haven't been defined or standardized, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. As Kuhn pointed out yesterday or the day before, there are 28 countries within the European Union and 24 languages. And that's just the European Union. Then we can expand to Moldova, to the Ukraine, to Belarus. I mean, it goes on and on. We're also facing individual market pressures, and this is not just a pressure within an individual country, but within areas of country. If you go to, for example, northern Poland, to the Tri-City area, Gdynia, Gdansk, Sopot, up in East Pomerania, the problems they face in terms of selling interaction design, information architecture, the concept of user experience are very different than down in Galicia, down in Krakow. You go to Slavonia in Croatia. What they're dealing with is very different than what you'll see in Dalmatia, and so on and so forth. We're a very, very interesting community. We're not the United States of Europe, and we never will be. We have a very, very different cultural heritage, and we have very interesting problems that we need to solve. And I think that that's something that actually makes us valuable. I lost my watch. I don't know where I am. That's good. We should be very proud of being Europeans. We have a lot to offer, and we see the world in a much more nuanced way than many of our North American cousins, except for maybe the Texans and Californians. Now, there's some downsides that we should be aware of. I think we need to be careful that we don't love the process more than we love the results. It's easy to fall back on process because you can always defend the results, right or wrong, by saying, yeah, but the process was good. Now, I was raised in the United States, which is why I have the accent I do, and during the early 60s, the American school system practiced something called the new math. Now, the new math focused on the process. It was much more important to figure out how people had arrived at the solution than whether the solution was actually right or not. This is kind of a bizarre idea to teach people mathematics where you kind of didn't care if they got the right answer or not. Very bizarre. And when we talk about process, we need to remember to look. let's focus on the results. The results have to be good. The process is a means to an end. The process is not the end itself. There are other things happening right now. Certainly responsive design is something that we haven't talked a lot about this weekend, but it's something that everyone is worried about. What worries me about responsive design, and I'm not talking about the BBC or any of the other big sites that we've heard about this weekend, but I'm thinking about the 99.9% of all the other websites that are now responsive, which are basically big, long pages of text with some pictures and some page anchors at the top. That's kind of what we were designing back in 1994. It also implies a linearity that defeats the whole purpose of information architecture in that people start reading at the beginning and they scroll and they read some more and more and more. I think we need to be careful that we don't lose so many of the things that we've learned over the past 20 years. Happily, I think responsive is just a phase we're going through, or at least the way in which we're implementing it. More worrisome is that I'm also seeing communities become responsive, or reactive, you might say, rather than proactive. I had an interesting phone call a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine in Bucharest, and he had looked at the new curriculum for the Romanian Institute of Technology. He said, you know, they're no longer training people to be thinkers and programmers. They're training people, they're giving them exactly enough information so that they can get a low-level job as an outsourced resource for rich Western European and North American countries. This is something that we need to guard against. We have a lot to offer. Romania and also Bulgaria are interesting countries because of politics, because of the language. I see some of the most innovative things coming from Eastern Europe. But that's not going to continue if, you know, we dumb people down and say, no, we're just going to teach you to be code slaves. I haven't heard of other instances, but I kind of suspect they exist, and it worries me. We also have a lot of myths in our community, and many of them are propagated by social media. Let me tell you a little bit about a propaganda concept known as the big lie. The big lie was developed by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels in the 1920s. And there are two parts of this. The first is, if you repeat the same lie often enough, people will start to think it's true. The other part is that if you tell a lie that is so outrageous, people are going to say, well, that can't be true. But there's probably something to it. And we're seeing this on social media. I mean, we repeat mobile first often enough, and everybody says, yeah, mobile first. And we heard from Christina and Matthew yesterday, yeah, if they had gone into their bosses and said mobile first, the budget would have been there, everything would have been wonderful. But instead, they actually did the research and they found out, oh, tablet first. Who knew? I've never heard anybody talk about tablet first. But of course it's out there. These are important things. This is also why the research is important. We have a lot of big lies, and we have to make sure that we are actually building our community and just not just propagating or parroting what other people have said, including whatever I say today. What I say today, I may disagree with in a month or two because I'll learn better, because I learned from all of you. Then we have the most... the minimum viable product, the MVP. This was a concept developed by my almost namesake, Reiss, who wrote The Lean Startup. Now, the idea behind the MVP is, you know, what can we do to learn the most with the least effort? But a lot of the companies I work with espouse the idea of the MVP, but they say, okay, how can we earn the most with the least effort? This is a very difficult situation that we need to work on. Now, there's also an upside. We've had an economic downturn, and that's actually been good because UX was adopted, and to some extent still is, as a buzzword. Information architecture too, to some extent. And what has happened is that we've seen a lot of UX companies close. And that is good, because most of these were not actually doing UX. They were doing WordPress implementations and other things. I mean, it was, oh, we're going to be a UX shop because there are so many other second-rate web developers around, you know, we'll be something else. But they weren't doing UX. And these companies are closing. And I think that's a very good thing. And also in big markets. New York, San Francisco, Seattle, London, Amsterdam. Great. Get rid of them. UX is also not just something that you see on screen, nor is IA. Service design is on the rise. I mean, we heard wonderful case stories from Alessandro, from Altoona. This is incredibly important. We have got to think broader than what size screen we're working with, all this kind of nonsense. Now, predicting the future is frustrating. And that's because it's not that things don't come true, but it's just that it takes so damn long to do so. You know, changing the world takes more time than I'd like, and you know, it was frustrating 10 years ago, and it's certainly frustrating now. I mean, we heard from Alex Wright yesterday. My goodness, we heard not only about Paul Gauguin, but for 500 years people have been thinking about some of the same things that we're discussing now. We just have better technology than they had. They were putting things on playing cards. We're putting things in the cloud. So what we're doing is not really new. We have to understand that user experience has always been around. The current trends right now, yeah, we need people skills. We need research. Cross-functional teams work better. We're still fighting for budgets for research and usability testing. That's a shame. We're not yet a respected discipline. UX is not a respected discipline. And you know, if you look at other professions, if you look at doctors and lawyers, you think that they go to conferences and discuss soft skills? When's the last time any of you talked to a lawyer? Do you think they have soft skills? My goodness. But they're respected professions. We, on the other hand, are still building on belief. And so, look, trust us. We know what we're doing. If you do what we suggest you do, you're going to make money and everything's going to be good. But it is belief. There was an American economist and social theorist by the name of Stuart Chase, who was a contemporary of Thorstein Veblen in the 1880s. And he said, you know, for those who believe, no proof is necessary. But for those who don't believe, no proof is possible. We've got to move away from belief. That's not going to move us in the right direction. And I've seen this now for 20 years. It's a difficult sell, but I think that we need to start to rethink how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the business community, because ultimately they're the people who are paying the bills. I'm seeing very, very good people being nominated for a promotion but then passed over. I know of at least 2 international thought leaders who have been laid off within the last month. That suggests, number one, that their former employers have no clue what kind of a resource they have and don't know how to use that resource. And I think that goes back to the fact that there are so many companies that still have this very nebulous idea of what we do in terms of information architecture, user experience, and so on. The sad fact is that easily communicated ideas are the ones that people accept. And this is where the consultants get off easy, because they come in and they say something that sounds good, sounds easy, and they make a lot of money. And we're the ones who have to clean up the mess. We're moving from a trade to a profession. We now have books, we have academic articles. That's a good thing. But we cannot discount empirical experience. We're still making this up as we go along, and that's not a bad thing. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Empirical experience is incredibly important. So the question is, where do you want to be in 10 years? Where would you like to see our community in 10 years? This is what we need to start thinking about. Now, my own view of the future is, a lot of the basic problems, these first world problems of battery lifetime and connectivity, they're going to disappear. That's going to get sorted out. More importantly, I think that we're not going to be talking about apps or websites or any of this thing anymore. We're going to be talking about designing data systems and how this data is being used. That's going to be the interesting thing. However, there is one key concern that I haven't heard anything about this weekend, and that does worry me a great deal. If data is so valuable, why do we give it away so freely? To Facebook, to Google, to Amazon? I think privacy settings are going to be the currency of the future. Right now, the Facebooks and the Amazons and the big companies who are collecting this stuff, they say, hey, but we're giving you this great service. You just have to give us a little information. LinkedIn. We're giving away a lot more than we think. Let me just take a moment and read a quote to you. It's from a book from 1949. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time, but at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement was scrutinized. This is from George Orwell's 1984. And that's a pretty good description of my Samsung Smart TV. There was a very interesting experiment in Denmark that was performed earlier this year where they designed an application, a flashlight application for a smartphone. Something that would turn on the LED so you could navigate in a dark room. But what they did was, in order to be able to use this flashlight program, you had to give up, I don't know how many different permissions. Now, because this was a controlled test, they were very careful with how they used that information, but they got politicians and business leaders, clerics, all kinds of people to test their program. But what they could do was basically turn on the microphone anytime they wanted to, turn on the camera anytime they wanted to, download every message, every photo, everything that was in that telephone. Which shocked the hell out of some minister of whatever in Denmark, because all her private conversations at some meeting had been recorded and were played back for her. And yet the permissions that we're talking about here are really no different than the permissions that we've already given to Facebook. I looked for a Che Guevara beret on Amazon, and suddenly Facebook is showing me advertisements for berets. And within 2 weeks, I was getting unsolicited emails from left-wing political organizations. I have a good friend in the United States, a conference organizer who is being chastised at the moment. He's a very honorable man, by the way, because somebody who had attended his conference started to get mails from, I think, Coca-Cola. He said, well, he must have sold the mailing list. It indicates how naive some people are in terms of how our information is being used. So I beg you, this is something we have an ethical, a moral, and a legal obligation to address. We have got to start thinking about this. It really is important. Now, we have a little time, and I'm going to actually make you work a little bit. I've shared some of my thoughts in terms of the future. But there was a fellow by the name of Alan LaKine who back in the 70s or 80s wrote a book, How to Get Control of Your Time in Your Life. And what I'd like to do is spend the next, say 10 minutes doing a little exercise with you, if you don't mind. So if you all find 3 sheets of paper, get them out. I realize you've already had 3 days of bookshops, but I figured, you know, a good aim is the same as a good beginning. Okay, so on the first piece of paper, I want you to write a question at the top. What are my lifetime goals? What are my lifetime goals? And what I want you to do is use a minute or two just to write down whatever comes to mind. I want to sleep with a Hollywood star. I want to fly to the moon. Whatever you want to do, write it down. This is kind of your bucket list. Just spend a minute doing that, and then we'll move on to the second part of this. They can be as crazy as you want. Okay, have you all got a couple of things down on the paper now? What I'd like you to do is rank these, A, B, and C. If it's something that is really important for you, give it an A. If it's slightly less important, give it a B. And if it's something that's kind of a nice to have, give it a C. Okay?
Ranking or rating?
What?
Ranking or rating?
Rate. Rate the words and the things that you have on your goals list. Yeah, with an A, B, or C. How important are these goals to you? Okay, I see a lot of you looking up. Are you more or less there? Good. So put that piece of paper aside. Don't throw it away. But take your second piece of paper. And at the top of the second piece of paper, write, how would I like to spend the next 3 years? And if you're over 30, then write, how would I like to spend the next 5 years? And again, just get as much down as possible. How do you want to spend your time? What do you want to be doing? This is the most quiet I've heard at a EuroIA conference in 11 years. Okay, are you all pretty much done? Good? Good. Take your third piece of paper.
No rating?
What?
No rating?
No rating there. No rating. Now, so the first question was, what are my lifetime goals? The second is, how do I want to spend the next 3 to 5 years? All right, here's the killer question. If I knew I was going to be hit by lightning in 6 months, what would I do tomorrow? You have 6 months. You're going to die in 6 months. What are you going to do tomorrow?
Just tomorrow or?
Tomorrow and the next 6 months. There's a lot of thinking involved in this. And you don't have to finish these now, but I would urge you to take these pieces of paper home. There are 3 really good questions. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because this is a very personal kind of thing. But I know that some of you, on that last piece of paper, are probably saying, I really wouldn't change anything. I like what I'm doing, and I'm going to continue doing it until I get struck by lightning in 6 months. But I also know that there are some of you who are going to say, I'm going to throw it all out. I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to sell my flat, and I'm going to go trekking in Kathmandu. There are no right or wrong answers. But what I urge you to consider is, if your answer is radically different than what you're doing now, please consider whether that really, what you're doing now is really leading toward any of the life goals that are on your first piece of paper. The reason I ask this, and the reason I spent time, valuable time during the plenary, getting you to do this is that, you know, we talk, yeah, go out and change the world, be yourself. What are all those cliches at the beginning? Follow your dream, follow your heart, find out what you love, be true to yourself. I mean, that's kind of what it builds up to. But I don't think that we ask these questions of ourselves as often as we probably should. And so in terms of UX, in terms of information architecture, in terms of how we're going to use this sea of information to actually do something good, fine. What is our place? Let's spend a little time to evaluate what is our role in this community. You know, are we going to change the world, or are we just going to let the world take care of itself? Now, it's very depressing, but the world does take care of itself. I thought it was very important that I watch the news, and you know, I go off someplace where I didn't have access to the news. This is back in the old days before we had smartphones. And you know, I'd come back to Denmark, and you turn on the news and you find out that, well, the world is sort of muddled on without me, which is very depressing, because I thought, you know, I was really providing a great public service by being an informed citizen. So figure out how you're going to contribute, or are you going to contribute, and if so, how? There have been some discussions that perhaps we're kind of in the dark ages of interaction design. We're very complacent with our tools and our processes and our what all. And, have we reached a plateau? I don't know. You can argue for and against it. But if we say that we're in the dark ages of information design because of complacency, then which of you are going to go and be our Renaissance leaders? Who's going to be the Leonardo? If you look at the great design movements of the past, where's today's Gropius from the Bauhaus, or William Morris from the arts and crafts movement, or Joseph Hoffman from Wiener Werkstätte? Jesse James Garrett posed this question in Memphis several years ago at the Information Architecture Summit and said, can you find a site and say, oh, well, that was designed by, name an information architect. We can't do that. Now, I'm not sure that that's necessary, but it's certainly an interesting thought, and I think it bears repeating here. We have thought leaders in our community, certainly, but do we have movements that are moving things in a good way, apart from, oh, we're going to have MVPs and we're going to have mobile first and we're going to do this. Mobile first is, by the way, is a very good thing. Unfortunately, it's often interpreted as mobile only. That's the problem. So anyway, look at your papers and figure out where you want to be. Take them home. Think about this. Go back to them in a couple of days. I promise you it's a very useful exercise, and I hope you'll continue. Do remember, though, the truths that you've learned these past few days, past few years are going to change. And if you still think the same way about things in 5 years as you do today, you are going to fail. There's a French philosopher, Gilles de Faubourg, who said, "Cease not to learn until thou cease to live. Think that day lost, wherein thou drawest no letter to make thyself more learned, wiser, and better." I think that those are great words to live by. However, I also would like to say that there are certain kinds of failure that are not necessarily bad. So I want to end this by telling you a little story. I came to Denmark when I was 22 years old as a director at the Royal Theatre, the Danish Royal Theatre. I ended up in communication. It's a long story, and I won't plague you with this, but I was working for an advertising agency. I was very interested in interactive design, and I had published the information architecture book, and I got fired. That was 15 years ago. I was 46 years old, and since then, written 2 books. I've run a multinational design agency. We have offices and associates in 11 countries. And the truth is, if I hadn't been fired, I'd be some fat, half-alcoholic old copywriter in a small Danish advertising agency. And there would be somebody else giving this talk. So not all failure is a bad thing. If you have time, I urge you to Google Conan O'Brien. He's an American comedian, and he delivered the closing commencement speech at Dartmouth. I'm sorry, I'm breaking some teeth for a friend. Dartmouth University back in 2011. And as a comedian, his hero was another comedian by the name of Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson's hero was an earlier comedian during the 30s and 40s by the name of Jack Benny. Well, Johnny Carson didn't become Jack Benny, and Conan O'Brien didn't become Johnny Carson. Conan O'Brien said one of the wisest things I've heard in a long time. He said, "It is our failure to become our perceived ideal that ultimately defines us and makes us unique." You are all unique. You truly are. You can change the world, and some of you will. And thank goodness for that. And on that happy note, thanks, I'm done.